Hello, 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 everyone. It's Friday. It's Friday. I'm so excited. I'm so excited. We missed our live commentary last week for a multitude of reasons, mainly because we had the book club. And I always miss doing this with you. So as much as I love the book club and I love our book club discussion, our final book club discussion, because we really only because the final book club discussion is longer. That's why we don't do the live commentary. But we're back. I'm back. Hopefully you're back. And we're going to have a great time today. So we only have an hour because I have the final discussion for I Am Plant at the end of this. So since we only have 1 hour, we're going to try to dive into things because I tried to pick a paper that wasn't too long. But of course, I'm worried that it's a lot longer than I think it is. So, and I didn't want to do a two-parter, but one day I will live stream for longer periods of time and we won't have this problem, but we're not there yet. So we're not there yet. I'm not there yet. Okay. So today we are talking about phytomorphizing performance. Isn't that a fantastic title? Super exciting. This is phytomorphizing performance. This is plant performance in an expanded field. I have to admit, I have not read anything about this paper, but the title just captured me, totally captured me. This is a paper from, hold on, let me look. The print is from 2019. So not even that long ago, I mean, in relation. So let me share my screen. Because again, we only have an hour today, so we're going to attempt to get through this in an actual hour, but without cutting any corners. So this is Text and Performance Quarterly. This is a paper. It's really not a paper. It's more of a long form essay from what I understand. And I am really excited to read through this because, as you know, in NCC, we spend a lot of time thinking about the arts and performance and how these different aspects can really help us in our expansion of our plantness and the expansion of plant senses, and also to help us redefine our understanding and the paradigm around our connections to plants. So phytomorphizing performance, just come on, seriously, it sounded like the most amazing topic to have. So this is really all about post-humanism, about plants, about moving into the worlds of performance. And it looks like this is from somebody named Travis Brisini. Travis Brisini, Department of Communications, Arts and Sciences at Pennsylvania State University. So let's just completely dive into this and see where it takes us. So the abstract around this says, this essay, so see, a long form essay, and it's very long form because it's 20 pages. So this essay embraces the possibility offered by the non-human turn in the humanities and social sciences and forwards the claim that plants as are performers. In so doing, the essay analyzes the common claims about the ontology of performance, demonstrates how plants meet a strict rubric of evaluation for consideration as performers, and offers potential repercussions and opportunities for performance theory if a plant performance is seriously considered. And I'll give you one of the reasons why this also caught my attention is because as a person who's worked with the music of the plants for a long time, as you know, in the music of the plants, right, we're looking at plants as musicians. And that terminology took so long to kind of get that vernacular. At first, people would use the term singers. I don't understand why they would use singers and like plants sing. And I'm like, no, they're musicians, right? They make music. Composers is another terminology. So I think musicians and composers has been the terminology that I've used a lot. And so now the idea of here embracing all of this with the idea of plants as performers, which ties into my recent love of everything Nathaniel Myers around how as a dancer, as a human dancer, and how she uses the dancing to connect into the plant world. So I'm really excited about where this essay is going to take us to better understand and better think about the way that we look at performance. So it has been said that trees are imperfect men and seem to bemoan their imprisonment rooted in the ground. But they never seemed so to me. I never saw a discontented tree. They grip the ground as though they liked it. And though fast rooted, they travel about as far as we do. John Muir. I Love that quote. Wow, what a great quote. And it's so true, right? This idea that rooted actually means imprisoned is this false dichotomy that's brought upon by the human ontology of movement, and in the sense of legs, and not even seeing all other forms of movement. So this is an essay about the state of the field, about the state of the academic field, a collection of academic texts, a scholarly community, a shared benediction about what matters to and what counts as performance. About the state of the field, a collection of floral lives, all stick and leaf and blousy bloom, buzzing bugs and wind-rippled sway. I already can tell that I'm going to love this. At least so far, I am loving this. So hopefully you're loving this too. It is also a question, might we be able to bring the overgrown field under the age of conjunction with? Well, let's keep going. And therefore find a way to understand the role of performance by and for plants. Does anybody remember way back during the COVID times when a theater filled its entire seats with plants and did a concert? Be honest, as you read that, aren't you envisioning that same thing, right? I can see it both ways, like a role. I've seen performance by plants. I've seen it with Master Plants Orchestra. I've seen it with concerts that I myself have given, where plants have been on stage, multiple plants in a beautiful arrangement, creating music and composing music together. And through that action, we saw a concert or a performance for plants. So I think as musicians, we're definitely moving in this field. And I'm going to be curious to see whether or not this author, Travis Brisini, I think it was, I'll go back and look. Brisini, excuse me, what Travis Brisini has ever seen a plant music concert, because I wonder if that's going to fit in here somewhere. Anyway, might we, in other words, collapse these fields, see them as a single field? As the variety of topics examined through performance begins to broaden, becomes relational, becomes post-humanist, or more than human, or whatever flavor of turn suits your fancy. So I wish you would have defined turn in this case. So too does the utility of the performance paradigm broaden for understandings a whole host of human and non-human interactions. With this essay, I make the case that performance is far more omnipresent than we may initially assume, and that it serves as a guiding principle for a host of non-human lives that are radically, get it, radically, unlike the majority of entities and interactions usually considered in performance research. Plants, that is, are performers. You got me. You got me. You've sold me. I am sold on this concept and yes. To begin, I'd like to offer a brief history of the inclusion of other than plants into performance. And this really matches beautifully into Giovanni Aloi's with, what's her name? I'm really bad with names today. Estado Vegetal. It's a performance piece that was done by, all right, that's it. I got to look it up because I feel like I'm not giving you good names. Manuela Infante. I feel really bad about not giving you the names of people. Manuela Infante created this performance piece called Estado Vegetal, so vegetal state. And then Giovanni Aloi, I think, has taken that and turned it into maybe a book, I think it was. And so definitely looking at the vegetal as more of a performer and a performance. The cross-disciplinary academic field, the cross-disciplinary academic movement dubbed animal studies came earlier into performance studies and brought with it a flurry of interest in animals in performance, as well as animals as performers. Rin Tin Tin, Lassie. I think they're thinking beyond that, but you know, those are the ones that actually, that's not true. I also have visions of various bears that have been in books and in movies. Anyway, sorry. There were, however, distinct differences in how animals were approached, depending upon the disciplinary inclination, either theater-oriented or communication-oriented, of the researcher and publication venue. In the Eastern tradition of performance studies research associated with theater, the focus on animals has been voluminous. A 2000 issue of Performance Research on Animals proposed a broadening of performance beyond the confines of the discretely human, a thrust that was quickly picked up and expanded by Chaudhuri. During the intervening 2 decades, a call to attend to performance by and about non-human agents has become commonplace. TDR published a special issue, edited by Chaudhuri, on animals and performance in 2007, while dozens of books have been published, collecting essays both about non-human animal performances and performances about or with animals. A recent issue of Performance Research, Turning Animal, continues this trend of focusing on aesthetic forms concerning animals, but also moves towards cultural performances in which the boundary between humans and animals is complicated through material and reciprocal interaction. As May succinctly puts it, critical animal studies constitutes an important eco-critical debate in theater and performance studies. I can see that. I can totally see that. I'm curious as to which direction he's going to take this argument around the animals. The Midwestern tradition associated with communication and speech has been less eager to embrace the non-human term. It seems likely that this reticence is derived from a philosophical geniality. I have silver away. Thank you, Lori. That was funny. Yes, agreed. Hi-ho, silver away. Beautiful horses, definitely non-human in and with performance for a long time with human beings. Yes. It seems likely that this reticence is derived from a philosophical genealogy that has difficulty integrating non-human others into a paradigm focused on language and symbolic communication. There are, however, a number of noteworthy exceptions. Gray's work clearly addresses the possibilities of non-human performance, both in terms of aesthetic performance, as well as communication studies work that integrates animals. The clearest examples of animal studies inflected performance research in this Midwestern tradition stem from a 2016 issue of Text and Performance Quarterly, devoted to post-human relations in performance studies. First of all, who knew that there was all this like intense research relating to performance? I didn't. In this issue, Gingrich Philbrook examined Conquer Good's concept of lethal theater in context of executed giraffe named Moore. Oh my God, I'm going to reread that sentence because I got caught. In this issue, Gingrich Philbrook examined Conquer Good's concept of lethal theater in context of an executed giraffe named Morris. Broderick and Gleason's explored the embodied materiality and ethics of farming and agriculture, and Haas documented the work of photographing the annual slaughter of marine mammals at the Tai Cove in Japan. My own recent work regarding flightless birds and evolution also falls into this category. Wow, this is expanding. I just realized how narrow I was thinking about this when I was first reading the beginning. Wow, like talk about something that just showed up my biases. And that's what I love about reading these papers at a first glance with you, because I recognize that because I don't live in a lot of the realms in which these papers are formed. In other words, I am not a scholar of performance arts, for example. What I do is pick up a broad mix of different topics that are connected to plants, and to the vegetal world, which is awesome because I come into it very ignorant to a certain extent in a good way, with a very broad knowledge about the plants, but very limited knowledge about the actual sphere that we're working in. And so I just realized that I was thinking of certain types of performances when I read the word performance, and yet like look at all of these works that are being mentioned here, everything from the documenting the work of photographing, and of certain kinds of performance pieces, and even works that are in a performance realm expanding on our concepts, which is something I honestly love. I mean, I really do. I've always been one to, as you know, I love art. I go to a lot of different art exhibits and art kind of installations, and I specifically love installation work and immersive installations. When I was doing my own master's, one of the projects that I worked on was the designing of a very immersive experience of a united vegetal human world? What would that city look like? And I had designed an entire exhibition space that you walked through in order to experience this vegetal connection, from starting from disconnection to very integral connection, using architect and biophilic design, but also even going farther beyond the confines of our imagination, and more importantly, the confines of our own fears, relating to how might we share a city environment with other kin. And yet, when I started reading this, I was thinking more stage and performance in that perspective, instead of thinking of performance pieces and of other kinds of embracing arts that could help illuminate or shine lights on different aspects of the relationship between humans and other kin. So I'm recognizing my biases and my limitations, and I'm excited to go beyond them. From a broader perspective of communication studies, the inclusion of non-human entities could be seen to arrive via Kennedy's theory of rhetoric as energy, a suasive force found in language, but also in physical actions, facial expressions, gestures, and signs generally. Consequently, as Kennedy points out, animal rhetorics fall within the purview of communications research, as animals share the complex social and bodily habits that communicate via representational signs. While conscious intent cannot be assumed in the case of most animal communication, unless you really do animal communication, like telepathic type, the reality is that meaning is transmitted insofar as we understand meaning to be the interpretation given to the communication by another animal. Communication as a field of study is therefore equipped to address broad-reaching interspecies patterns of signification. The 2017 special issue of Rhetoric Society Quarterly, devoted to a rhetorical bestiary, is an obvious effort to integrate animals into the conceptual purview of rhetorical communication studies. The issues aim to recognize nature's voice and acknowledge non-human agency. Well, non-human animal agency, really, is a move that is sympathetic, albeit not precisely identical, to the animal turn in performance. While there is undoubtedly nuanced disagreement and debate within the scholarly community of animal studies, inflected performance studies, I believe that it is safe to say that recent developments in performance studies theater and practice augur the embrace of a non-human term. Technically, yes. An assumption that the human has always co-evolved, coexisted, and collaborated with the non-human, and that the human is characterized precisely by this indistinction from the non-human. The animals are likely here to stay, and we in performance studies must make room for them in our theorizing. Okay, I'm gonna hope we're gonna get to the plants soon. Not just the plants. One of I worked with I worked very, very briefly, and worked was more is a too broad of a term. I had contacted and connected with, is a better way of saying it, with this group that did. They were really mostly a design group, and they did amazing things with like diatoms and with algae, and in creating beautiful, how do I say this? Diatoms, luminescent diatoms in particular. And so they were creating these, I'm going to use the word object for now, but I'm going to take it into a different realm after that. They would create these objects like beautiful lanterns or other kinds of things that would, language is so limiting and sometimes that would go into your shared spaces that allowed these diatoms to share this space with you in the algae. Now, one could look at this, depending on if you have never had a conversation with the designer behind it, and think, oh, this is object, right? I'm creating something that glows. I'm using something that has this kind of luminescent value attribute to it. But in reality, when you would have a conversation with them, they were thinking way broader than that. They were thinking about the diatoms that are already in our space, in our shared space, and bringing them into a more visible sphere so that we could relate to them. And also, even with the algae, the idea was the algae was, yes, luminescent in some ways, so that you could have illumination, but also food, because the algae was being produced and then could be, through this beautiful way that the lamp was designed, could be siphoned off for food. And it was a way of bringing the light, the photosynthetic nature and the aliveness of this algae into your shared space. Like, There was also I think he was an architect and a designer who was doing chandeliers and other things relating to algae for this exact same reason. And it's fascinating because this algae has, again, through a light source, it's not a luminescent algae, but the algae would like glow kind of based on this luminescence that was being put through, like these lighting that was being through, and then producing food and clearing up the air and really becoming an integral part of the space. And I found his description to be really apropos to a shared human, non-human environment, even though it could look from the outside like he was just creating beautiful objects, but his intention wasn't just like an air purifier, or, you know, it was more about the living nature of the algae, who, in just the same as I produce carbon dioxide through my regular living and I take in oxygen, these beings, right, this algae was doing the opposite, right, creating oxygen and then taking in other kinds of, not just carbon dioxide, but also impurities and things like that, and using that and transforming it to create this. So it was like a shared space. And I think that when we go shopping for things in our house, most of us will go to a normal store and, you know, even the IKEA. And so you think of everything as just a dead object. Yet when you purchase, or when you have the opportunity to come across this type of space with this understanding of it, everything becomes very different, because now it's a human, non-human relationship. It's kind of like the difference between buying a plant at, you know, your do-it-yourself hardware store or nursery that nobody really cares, versus, you know, the relationship that you build with a plant, maybe in other ways, maybe because the plant was gifted or because you rescued the plant. And so therefore the plant moves from the object perspective of something I buy and put in a corner to a member of my family. And I think that that's really part of, we need performance spaces of all different sorts to encourage us to explore these types of relationships that then we can bring into our lives in what seems like traditionally mundane or objectified ways, but with a new level of understanding and definition, so that the relationship between ourselves and these beings that have historically been thought of as objects changes. I hope that made sense. It really made sense. It made sense in my mind. It made sense in my mind. So, as evidenced by the above studies, there are relatively few barriers to integrating animals into an expanded vision of performance. There are, broadly speaking, clearly conscious, active, and interactional. The biological realities of our own human-animal bodies render their lives legible to us in a fashion that borders on the instinctual. Animalness, instinctualness. We've been having this conversation. See? Their motivations and desires are not so foreign to us as to be opaque. Consequently, most human persons have comparatively little trouble seeing them as agents or narrative subjects, in spite of the paradox that exists between millennia of instrumentalization and even longer stretches of affiliation and identification. They walk, fly, swim, and creep through the world's arts, serving amongst the earliest incitements to art making itself, whether the 35,000-year-old cave painting of Barbirusa on Sulawesi or the now lost folkloric arts of the earliest humans. In sum, even animals that are extremely unlike us in shape, size, and habit share enough similarities with our own animal lives to allow for a potential rendering via the lens of performance. This perspective, arguably anthropocentric and therefore somewhat limiting, has nonetheless made for a comparatively easy transition of non-human others into the pantheon of performers. Very direct, very easy to follow. Plants are a different story for performance theory, and perhaps an altogether more interesting one. No, not perhaps. Take the perhaps out of that sentence. Definitely a more interesting one. Generally, where animals are motile, plants are sessile, rooted. Where animals seem proactive, plants seem reactive. Not true. Where animal lives are measured in months or years, plant lives can stretch on for millennia. Yes. The communication of animals relies, as does our own, upon the sensorium of sights, sounds, tastes, smells, and touches. Yet, we laypersons see no evidence that plants communicate at all. Well, I would take the we out of there, you laypersons, because we here in NCC as sprouts, we know. Above their experience, they appear mute. Not true. Seemingly unfeeling, unthinking, we're still arguing this, and inexpressive. Inexpressive. At least of all of them, inexpressive. Have you not seen a plant? Like, inexpressive is not a term I would use. And yet, it is the contention of this essay that we have radically overlooked the plants. Yes. And that doing so has foreshortened the performance paradigm. Yes. We have not accounted for plants' active, intentional, and interactional lives. And performance theory is one means of beginning to remedy this oversight. I am so following you here. You go, Travis. You go, Travis. We must stop to consider, that is, both what performance might mean for plants, as well as what plants might mean for performance. We must begin the task of phytomorphizing performance. I am, yes, you've got me. My primary goal in this essay is to use the logic of performance to dematrix plants from our usual and ultimately adverse assumptions about their lives. As Cell notes, consideration via the rubric of performance has often served as a conceptual and aesthetic tool whereby commonly regarded mundane objects or scenarios were torn from the associations that commonly surround them, were torn from their traditional conceptual and experimental matrices of subjectivity, sociality, and tradition, from the commonly held information structures of memory and value. This is the reason why we have the book club, the Sprouts Writing and Creativity group, and all the other things, all the artistic activities that we have in NCC. This is why, for exactly that whole sentence. And thereby made available for renewed scrutiny. Dematrixing is an operation that is similar to Schlossky, a proposed process of artistic defamiliarization, wherein the purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. I just want to hold that sentence for a second because I really, really like that sentence. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. Dematrixing through performance achieves this defamiliarization by stripping an idea or entity from its traditional context, botanical and instrumental consideration in the case of plants, and reinserting into an unfamiliar or unaccepted conceptual space, performance. This dematrixing of plants and the subsequent claim that plants are performers allows me to make a disciplinary intervention into two common interrelated conceptual operations: the tendency to ignore plant life as a boring, unremarkable, absolute otherness, hate that, and the subsequent tendency to anthropomorphize performance. The first intervention unsettles the commonplace assumptions that plants are, for the most part, passive and inert organisms. This assessment is an intellectual artifact of our anthropocentric and zoocentric tendencies towards taking the measure of life by means of a human metric. By examining the active, agential lives of plants, man, I need you over in the plant humanities, like in the plant critical studies world, because these assertions are very interesting. This essay reveals plants to be entities deserving of renewed scrutiny and consideration, particularly in light of their widespread instrumentalization. While a tendency towards instrumentalization by humans is widely disparaged in the case of animals and is typified by a plea and an exhortation to change our relationship with animals, very little consideration is given to plants. You go. Nealon, in the preface of his recent work considering plants in light of contemporary philosophical concerns, describes a reaction of outright hostility when the subject of plant rights or vegetal life is raised in academic animal study contexts. If you remember, when I did the commentary on the Plant Initiative sort of report and why animal studies, animal rights kind of initiatives can only really be so much of a model, because that relies and is not supported by, it leans on the idea of this recognition that he talks about earlier, that Travis Brisini talks about earlier, about how we kind of are an animal and therefore it's easier for us to extend these rights to animals. But when it comes to vegetal life, we need a whole different argument process, because the discussion of trying to look at it from a familiarity doesn't work at all. The lives and deaths of plants for food, raw materials, and as incidental waste occur on an astronomical scale, one that dwarfs the already staggering numbers of instrumentalized animals. As Hall writes, there is a tension between the recognition of plants as living beings and the need to kill plants on a daily basis to survive. Rather than acknowledge this killing and face possible limits to human action, hierarchies suppress it. Yes. This is such an important, remember I keep saying, the shift in the paradigm is blocked by our inability to understand and to recognize these two parts that have to be held in the same, at the same level. One, plants have agency, intelligence, consciousness, whatever words you want to use that feel good for you, to recognize that they are their own beings with their own rights and responsibilities, and at the same time that it is inevitable that the way that our earth has been constructed, the way that we live, it is impossible to not kill plants. Just the same as, to a certain extent, it's impossible not to kill animals. I think that there's room for improvement on when and how and the relationship and all these different aspects. But even when you look at the natural world devoid of humans, there is a strong relationship and understanding that you have all these beings, and yet there is killing that has to happen. But if we don't look at this indirectly and acknowledge that these two things could feel very divergent, because our human understanding is thou shalt not kill, which I would argue that the problem is not that you have to kill plants as well as give them rights, but the problem is in part the idea that thou shalt not kill. It's just not, it's not natural to say thou shalt not kill. It's just not natural. How many of us, I wonder, stand before the bin of onions in the grocery store? Onion starts. Sorry, it was one of our prompts in the writing group this week, so it just fails. Stand before the bin of onions in the grocery store and stop to consider that we are in the presence of hundreds of still living organisms that will be butchered alive to provide a piquant accent to our salads. I am going to read that sentence again because I want you to think about it, because I definitely think about it, and it's not that easy to think about. How many of us, I wonder, stand before the bin of onions in the grocery store and stop to consider that we are in the presence of hundreds of still living organisms, add the salad, and it goes to a whole new level, that will be butchered alive to provide a piquant accent to our salad. Your salad is still alive. Just so you know, you're putting it in your mouth. You are a cannibal. Cannibal. That's okay. That's okay. While I am not proposing to offer moral guidance on or behavioral dictates for this and any other such scenario, essays such as this one are the opening salvo in reconsidering our relationship with the vegetal others, an effort to respect what Plumwood has dubbed divergent agency. This concept marks the recognition that living beings exist and can be valued outside of instrumentalizing appraisal, as we note in them a validated difference that marks their autonomous importance, rather than viewing them only as part of the human self, alike to self, or as means to self's end. The second disciplinary intervention has to do with the habit of thought related to the aforementioned anthropocentric thinking. Performance theories inadvertently impoverish the conceptual utility of the performance concept that we equate performance writ large with human performance. We do so as our rubrics for what counts as performance or performed behavior are implicitly linked to the morphological capabilities of the human body in all of its embedded forms of ableness. Oh, I can't wait till you hear the podcast episode that I just recorded today. I believe it's going to be episode 56, so it's going to come out in a few weeks. But so connected. Make note of that. We perform the same centering of the human if we treat performance as inextricably from the signifying role of representation via linguistic or other semiotic systems. As mentioned earlier, this anthropomorphizing extends even to the case of non-human animal performance. When we identify and prioritize non-human performance as that which is similar to human performance, we diminish the utility of the performance concept. That is, when we cannot conceive of a performance that exceeds the temporal, motile, and corporeal scale of humanity. Considering a plant performance, which breaks with all three of these scalar concerns, will allow us to more fully map the opportunities afforded by the performance paradigm. Even the music of the plants is within this, because we are taking music of the plants, and by calling them musicians and treating them in such a way, the plants essentially take over a humanly understood realm. Now, I've always thought of it this way. In order to start to give plants our autonomy, we first have to recognize plants. And music is a first step in allowing the plants to have their own, to express their own agency in some ways. My hope, and I was just talking about this with a colleague this week, is that over time we will develop more and more types of devices that allow for plants to further express themselves outside of the constructs that humans have created for music. Music is very structured. It has scales, it has certain kinds of notes, it has certain intervals. We have come to understand melody through rhythms that are very, very, very human. So today, the music of the plants devices, most of them, not all of them, not all kinds of like plant music devices, and not even the music of the plants specifically, not all the scales are completely human, but a lot of them are. Why? Because when they're not, people are like, that's not music. So we need to first allow plants to kind of be seen. And then my hope is that we will continue to build devices that use very different intervals and structure, and that we start to recognize what does true plant music sound like. But we're just not there yet. Considering a plant performance, which breaks all three of the scalar concerns, will allow us to more fully map the opportunities afforded by the performance paradigm. In seeking to expand our performance toolkit, this essay will demonstrate that other novel approaches to performance surround us, enables our lives, and are available as potential arenas of scholarly inquiry and aesthetic expression. Preliminary objections, a review. The major preliminary objection to the notion of plants as performers can be boiled down to the fundamental assumption that plants are inactive and do not have behaviors. Under the umbrella of this concern, I can postulate a number of more specific possible objections to this idea. The first specific objection revolves around the concept of a performance as activity. Performance, in the words of Ellen Diamond, is a doing and a thing done. But is it? In other words, performance are actions and performers are active. Plants, as Afalo and Baller point out, are commonly understood to be passive organisms. Not true. You should just I have a few plants that will rock your world in that, because every time I look up, the completely different locations. No, not passive at all. Entities to whom events happen. We understand that plants undergo process of growth, but casually dismiss these activities as rote, mechanical, and genetically predisposed. By this line of thinking, plants could not be performers because they cannot be said to actively perform. A second related objection arises from the possibility that plants are, if passive organisms, unable to recreate behavioral conditions or actions. According to the Schneierian definition of performance as restored or twice behaved behavior, the passivity of plants would render them unable to replicate the conditions that they experience, or their own quasi-responses to organismic stimuli. Their passivity, by this line of thinking, renders them unable to replicate behaviors since they do not have much in the way of discernible actions in the first place. No replication means, by this schema, no performance. You know what's interesting about this one? I've never actually talked about this, but I've thought about it a lot. So one of the difficulties, and like I said the other day, I was talking with a colleague who is a music, like he works extensively with plant music and with plant performers. And one of the difficulties that he has is that, of course, every performance that he gives is pretty much unique because the plants are always generating new music, right? It's not like I can give them a score and say, okay, now you're going to play like this, like you would with a human musician. Or you can't teach them a set of tricks like an animal and say you're going to do these things in this order. And yet, we say, not we as in Sprouts, but the humans say that plants react according to a genetically predisposed script. Certain inputs have certain outputs. But if that was the case, wouldn't you then be able to create rote musicians? Because as long as you give them the same input, they would produce the same notes of music output. I mean, doesn't the fact that plant musicians do not memorize music and can't replay the music, even if you give them the exact same stimuli, go against your argument of the idea that plants are genetically predisposed to react to certain things in certain ways? I feel contradiction. I feel cognitive dissonance. What do you feel? What do you think? Is it cognitive? Because I feel cognitive dissonance there, like severe cognitive dissonance. The third objection is rooted in the notion that performances are simultaneously purposive and mutable. This objection operates on the assumption that the restoration of behavior occurs to some end, be it aesthetic, persuasive, etc., and that the replicative process is imprecise, resulting in minor alterations between the original and restored behavior that alters the content and reception of the performance. The presumed passivity and ontogenetic roots of plant morphology would seemingly render mutability unlikely, and therefore deprive a plant performance of the capacity for adaptation or alteration. I have to remember that he's like bringing forth the objections, and he's bringing them forth very clearly, I have to say. The fourth objection concerns the importance of communication and communication behaviors to the study of performance. Performance, including the embodied act of performing, as well as the epistemological maneuver of framing events or entities as performance, is commonly presumed to be a mode of communication. While we might embrace Capella's definitional minimalism in seeking to define communication as essentially any exchange wherein persons influence one another's behavior above and beyond that attributed to a normal baseline of actions, the more commonly held and less expansive view of communication in as performance is neatly summed up by Bauman defining performance as a mode of communication, behavior, and a type of communication event. While the term may be employed in an aesthetically neutral sense to designate the actual conduct of communication, as opposed to the potential for communicative action, performance usually suggests an aesthetically marked and heightened mode of communication, framed in a special way and put on display for the audience. This objection acknowledges the depth of the communicative performance paradigm to semiotic transfer. If plants cannot use signs, now I just envision like plants with little signs, which are the keys to marking and framing behavior in transaction with an audience, it is difficult to imagine them performing. To summarize, these interdependent hypothetical objections into a single representative example of this line of everyday thinking, common sense, about plants, we might consider the enormous sunflower that I can see from my office window. As per these objections, the plant is not a performer because it is not actively doing anything other than standing rooted in a single place, and is not obviously behaving in any way except perhaps growing as per its genetic code, or turning to face the sun, heliotropism, when it was a younger plant. And this pseudo behavior is apparently a variety of action that is non-conscious and mechanical. I have to breathe through those phrases. Undirected toward any semiotically linked audience. The plant may be clearly manifesting some, comparatively, rudimentary form of living, but it is not definitionally performing. In the remainder of this essay, I will offer a rebuttal to these objections. Yes. And demonstrate that extending the mantle of performance to plants is a sensible and worthwhile undertaking. Plants meet a strict rubric of evaluation as performers. Upon closer inspection of the active, behavioral, and morphological lives of plants, it is obvious that plants are capable of much more sophisticated interactions than we laypersons typically attribute to them. Finally, I will examine the repercussions for and the opportunities afforded to performance scholarship by this vegetal extension. Performance and activity. As Homera notes, when declaring an act or entity a performance, we are simultaneously acknowledging it as both an action as well as an object. This concern for the process-oriented awareness of a performance status as action, as activity, suffuses the disciplinary landscape of performance studies. In order to usher in a disciplinary era that accepts a broadened conception of performance, scholars must examine non-human entities for evidence of this requisite action. In the case of many animals, humans, and some technological constructs, their status as an active entity is obvious. In other cases, however, a more nuanced assessment of what constitutes activity is required. By that, does that mean that the performance where, what was her name? That woman, oh, I'm really blanking on names today, where she just sat there and like stared at the person in front of her for 2 minutes without moving? Would that not be performance because she wasn't actively moving? Or was that fact that she was sitting and staring, is that considered action? But plants don't? The assessment of plants as passive organisms stems largely from a general lack of awareness of plant physiology and behavior. Yes. This paucity of information is partially, as Wandersley and Schussler suggested, we know what word they're going to come up with. What is Wandersley and Schussler? You know this. Plant blindness. Rooted in the dissimilarity between our mammalian biological and subjective patterns of activity and the sessile lives of plants. Plants are so unlike us in form and lifestyle. Wandersley and Schussler contend that our anthropocentric and zoocentric conception of what constitutes life interferes with our ability to see them as living entities. We are stricken, that is, with plant blindness, the literal ignorance of plants by human beings and their spontaneous preferences for animal life. Unless we make a conscious effort to do so, most Westerners simply do not register the lives of plants that surround us and sustain our lives. They are, at best, scenery, not actor. None of that is true for any of you, okay? None of that is true for any of you. Plants are, however, living via acting. They demonstrate both purpose and intentional behaviors, responding in novel and holistic ways to their world. As Travis points out, Anthony, welcome Anthony, plants must compile environmental information and make active decisions to change development in order to optimize life cycle behavior and eventual fitness. For example, Schumann et al. Note that plants release different volatile chemical compounds at various times for various communicative purposes. In their review of the available literature, the author suggests that plants use chemical communication for within plant signaling, which also leads to eavesdropping on other plants, pollinators, attraction. Okay, hold on. In the essence of time, given the fact that we technically have 12 minutes, I am going to read this. We all know this aspect of plants. So when you read this, you can read the how he is defining them. So we know that plants communicate via volatile chemicals. Here he's talking about an example of clicking sounds. So these are the corn. This is Monica Galliano's research into corn seedlings and how that they make sound. So this is how they use sound as some form of expression. Also, we have plant hearing, which we know as it. Finally, the seemingly definitional trait of plants, their sessile nature. Michael Martyr, which, you know, we talk about Martyr all the time, points out that being in place of plants is hardly a passive enterprise because they have all this different activity that's happening. There's so much going on underneath. Let's see, we're talking about plant intelligence, which you have heard me talk about so many times. Martyr has pushed for an expanded interest in understanding the intelligence as located in the capacities of plants. And so he defines plant intelligence as what plants can do, as well as their unique perspective expressed at the cellular, organismic, and environmental levels. So these are all, rather than an intelligence concentrated and motile, willful, self-contained entity, as we often consider human intelligence, plant intelligence requires the subjective constitution of living space and time by the plants themselves, through the processes, capacities of growth. Plants manifest intelligence rather than necessarily possess it, though it's the sites in which they live their sessile lives. The intelligence is derived from an attentiveness to environmental stimuli that are salient to them, the interpretations of which are manifest through patterns of morphological alteration. These forms of growth and shedding are the fundamentals of plant behavior, more on this later, by understanding intelligence as not concentrated in a single organ, but rather as a property of the entire living being, pursuing a variety of intentionalities that are inextricable from its environmental context. The distributed intelligence of any given plant or species of plants radically alters our conception of how conscious, aware, and discrete an entity might need to be in order to be a performer. Yes, hold on, I want to look and see. We are on page 9, and we want to get to page, great, 17. You know, so that's 6 pages. I don't know if we can get through 6 pages in 9 minutes. I don't think so. I don't think we're going to do it, folks. I think we are going to have to hold that off. And I'm wondering whether or not action and intentionalities as the hallmarks of performance seems like a good place for us to start. I know that I'm stopping really early, and I'm kind of sad that I'm stopping early, but I feel like either I take up the time in I Am Plants to do this, or whether or not it'd just be better to do it next week. So I think we're going to stop right here because I am really getting into this and I'm very curious as to, I don't want to start the concept of the performance piece. Now we have already established what are some of the, hold on, we have established what are, the definitions of performance and the understandings of performance. We've defined what some of the objections would be to considering plants as performers and including them in the performance world. And now we're about to get into the actual hallmarks of performance and how is it that plants can be active agents in this. So I feel like this is a really great time to stop, because if not, we're going to go way over our time. As you know, I have been modifying the time in general rather than doing this for an hour on Fridays to do more. I would love to hear from you whether or not it would be better for me to include more times during the week. I know I've asked this question several times, and it might not even be, just, I don't know. I have to think about this. I'm very, I'd like to include more times. It's just hard to schedule it with my schedule, but I could add more spontaneous times, but I don't know if that's a good thing. So I'm still contemplating this concept. Either way, we are going to continue this next week. I'm actually really looking forward to it because I think this is going to be an excellent conversation. So with that, I'm going to leave you for now. You have about 7 minutes to get ready for our last conversation of I Am Plant, which has been amazing all week. I mean, our master classes have been so deep this time, so deep this time. So even if you haven't been able to join us live, please come into the Naturally Conscious community and you will see that all of the I Am Plant activities as well as the recordings are going to be up there for the next 2 weeks. So you have plenty of time to look through it, to listen, to participate, and to be an active contributor and to experience the depth of what we're doing right now in this new level of embodiment of your plantness. Until then, remember to resist the urge to hold back your emerging green brilliance. That's me, Tigre Gardenia. We will see each other next week as we continue on this paper of phytomorphizing performance. Bye.